Good evening, friends. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where we explore the past in the gentlest, most soothing way possible. Tonight, we're going to drift into a fascinating world that seems so elegant on the surface, the Victorian era. But beneath all those crinolines and top hats, there lurked dangers in the most unexpected places. I'm talking about wallpaper that could kill you in your sleep, toys that poisoned children, and dresses so beautiful they were literally toxic. Before we begin, go ahead and dim your lights if you haven't already. Adjust your pillow, pull that blanket up to just the right spot, and let your body sink into the mattress. Maybe light a candle if that's your thing, or just let the darkness wrap around you like a soft cocoon. Where are you listening from, and what time is it in your corner of the world? Let me know in the comments. I always love hearing from you, and if this calm journey helps you unwind tonight, if my voice becomes that familiar companion that guides you towards sleep, go ahead and tap that like button and subscribe. Only if it feels right, of course. No pressure here. This is your time to rest. Tonight's story is about a world obsessed with beauty, progress, and modernity. World that didn't quite understand the invisible threats surrounding them every single day. So let's step back in time together, shall we? Let your breathing slow, your thoughts drift, and allow me to tell you about the hidden dangers of Victorian life. Let me tell you about the most beautiful poison ever created. Picture this. You've just moved into a brand new London townhouse in 1862. The gas lights flicker warmly against your walls. And those walls are magnificent. They're covered in the most fashionable wallpaper money can buy. A stunning pattern of emerald green leaves and vines that seem to shimmer in the lamplight. It's called Shields green, and everyone who's anyone has it in their parlor. You have no idea that your beautiful walls are trying to kill you. Imagine settling into your favorite armchair each evening, breathing in the cool night air that drifts through the window, mixing with the warmth from your fireplace. The wallpaper seems to glow with an almost supernatural brilliance. That glow, my friends, comes from arsenic. Copper arsenite, to be precise, a chemical compound that creates the most vivid, stable green pigment the Victorian world had ever seen. And they put it everywhere. The story begins in 1775, when a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele invented this remarkable green pigment. Finally, the world had a green that didn't fade, didn't turn brown, and remained vibrant for years. Before Scheele came along, green dyes were notoriously unreliable. They'd start out promising and then fade to a sad, muddy brown within months. But this new green, this was revolutionary. And like many revolutionary things, it came with a cost nobody anticipated. Let your mind drift back to those Victorian parlors. The middle class was booming, and with new wealth came new desires. Everyone wanted to show their status, their taste, their modern sensibilities. And nothing said, "I've arrived," quite like a home decorated in the latest fashion. Wallpaper was the Instagram of the 1800s, the way you showed the world who you were. And green was everywhere. Not just any green, but this particular, brilliant, almost electric green that seemed to capture the era's obsession with nature, progress, and beauty all at once. The Victorians were nature-obsessed in the most delightful way. Ferns were a cultural phenomenon, seriously. They had fern fever, and people collected ferns the way we collect succulents today. Botanical prints covered everything. So naturally, green wallpaper with leafy patterns became the height of sophistication. William Morris, the famous designer, created some of the most iconic patterns of the age, many in various shades of green. His designs are still celebrated today, though the original versions were quite literally toxic. Here's where it gets interesting. In that slow, creeping way that makes for perfect bedtime storytelling, the poison didn't work like you might expect. You couldn't just touch the wallpaper and drop dead nothing so dramatic or obvious. Instead, it builds up in your system slowly, over months and years, causing symptoms that could be attributed to any number of Victorian ailments: fatigue, headaches, stomach troubles, respiratory problems, mysterious wasting diseases. The Victorians were always coming down with mysterious wasting diseases. But here's the truly insidious part, the detail that makes this story so perfectly tragic. The wallpaper was at its most dangerous when it got damp. And Britain, as you might know, is not exactly known for being dry. In the cool, humid climate, mold would grow on the wallpaper backing. This mold, a living organism just trying to survive, would metabolize the arsenic in the wallpaper, converting it into a gas, trimethylcene, if you want the technical term, though I prefer to just call it the invisible killer. This gas would waft off your walls, especially at night when you closed the windows and the air grew still and heavy. Imagine sleeping in your beautiful bedroom, decorated in the latest style, breathing in poison with every slow, peaceful breath. The smell would have been slightly musty, slightly sweet, nothing alarming, just the normal smell of an old house in a damp climate. You'd grow accustomed to it. You wouldn't know that every breath was depositing tiny amounts of arsenic into your lungs, your bloodstream, your organs. You'd just feel tired, run down, a bit off your game. Probably nothing, you'd think. Probably just need more fresh air. Maybe the weather. The children were most vulnerable, of course. They always are. Children playing on the floor, where the concentration of arsenic gas would be highest. Children with smaller bodies, smaller lungs, less ability to process and eliminate toxins. Victorian children were already facing so many dangers. Childhood mortality rates were staggering, but here was another threat, lurking in the very rooms where they were supposed to be safe and nurtured. Let me tell you about the investigations that finally brought this danger to light. A chemist named William Hines published research in 1857 demonstrating that arsenic-based pigments could be released from wallpaper. His work was largely ignored. The wallpaper industry was enormous, profitable, and the designs were simply too beautiful, too fashionable to abandon based on some chemists' concerns. This was the Victorian era, after all the age of progress and industry. Surely science could make beautiful things safely. Surely the modern world had moved beyond such primitive dangers. But the deaths kept accumulating, slowly and quietly. In 1862, a doctor named Lipscomb examined a family who had fallen mysteriously ill in their home. When he analyzed their environment, he found arsenic everywhere, in the wallpaper, in the dust, in the air itself. The family's bedroom had the highest concentrations, and surprise, surprise, that's where the sickest family members slept. His case study created a small stir, a few worried articles in newspapers, but wholesale change. That would take decades. Think about this as you settle deeper into your blankets. The danger was invisible, odorless, and slow-acting. The perfect poison, really. There was no immediate cause and effect, no dramatic poisoning scene like you'd see in a murder mystery. Just people gradually feeling worse, doctors diagnosing consumption or neurasthenia or any of a dozen fashionable Victorian ailments, and families grieving over losses they couldn't explain. The wallpaper was beautiful. The wallpaper was modern. The wallpaper was killing them, but so slowly, so subtly, that by the time anyone made the connection, the damage was done. And it wasn't just wallpaper, though that was certainly the main culprit. Arsenic-green showed up in fabrics, in artificial flowers. Those elaborate Victorian floral arrangements were often made with arsenic-dyed fabrics in children's toys, in paints, in food colorings. One of the era's most popular sweets was colored with arsenic compounds. Can you imagine giving your child a bright green candy, watching their face light up with joy, not knowing you were handing them poison? The Victorian era was obsessed with color in a way that's hard to understand from our modern perspective. Before synthetic dyes, most colors were dull, muddy, prone to fading. Then science gave them brilliant, stable, lasting colors, and they went absolutely wild. Fashion exploded. Interiors became riots of pattern and hue, and nobody stopped to ask what these miraculous new pigments were made from, or whether they might be dangerous. Progress was the goal. Beauty was the goal. Caution seemed old-fashioned, almost superstitious. Let your breathing slow down even more as I tell you about Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, that Napoleon. There's a theory, and it's just a theory, but a delicious one, that Napoleon was slowly poisoned by the arsenic wallpaper in his room during his exile on St. Helena. He died in 1821, and for nearly 2 centuries, historians and scientists have debated the cause. His symptoms are consistent with arsenic poisoning, and when researchers finally got permission to analyze samples from his wallpaper in the 1980s, they found high levels of arsenic, Scheele's green, covering the walls of the room where Napoleon spent his final years, slowly releasing poison into the air he breathed. Whether it actually killed him or just made his exile even more miserable is still debated. But imagine one of history's greatest military minds, defeated not by armies, but by wallpaper. The really maddening part of this story is how long it took for the industry to change. Even after the dangers were well documented, even after doctors and chemists published study after study, the wallpaper manufacturers resisted. Arsenic-based pigments were cheap, stable, and produced colors that were impossible to achieve any other way. Switching to safer alternatives would be expensive and would result in less vibrant products. So they downplayed the risks, published their own counter-studies, and convinced the public. Just open your windows, they said. Let in fresh air. As if British weather would cooperate with that plan year-round. It wasn't until the 1870s and 1880s that public pressure finally forced significant changes. Magazines like the British Medical Journal published articles warning about arsenic poisoning. Reform-minded doctors gave public lectures. Middle-class families, horrified at the thought of their beautiful homes harboring invisible dangers, began demanding arsenic-free alternatives. Slowly, painfully slowly, the market shifted. By the 1890s, arsenic-based pigments were finally falling out of favor. replaced by synthetic dyes that were mostly safer. But imagine all those decades in between. All those families living with poison on their walls, sleeping beneath toxic ceilings, playing on contaminated floors. All that suffering that could have been prevented if profit hadn't been valued over safety, if aesthetics hadn't trumped health, if the Victorian faith in progress and industry hadn't been quite so blind as you drift towards sleep. Think about the lesson hidden in this story. The Victorians thought they were living in a golden age of modernity and enlightenment. They believed science and industry had freed them from the primitive dangers of the past. They decorated their homes with the most beautiful, fashionable designs available, never imagining that beauty itself could be lethal. Sometimes the things that seem most civilized, most modern, most safe are hiding dangers we can't see or smell or taste. Sometimes progress moves faster than wisdom. The emerald walls shimmer in the gaslight. The pattern of leaves and vines seems almost alive and seems to breathe with the house itself. And somewhere in the cool, damp air of a Victorian night, poison rises silently from the walls, invisible and patient. But you're safe here, now, in your modern home, with your safe walls and your clean air. Let that knowledge comfort you as your eyelids grow heavy, as your thoughts begin to scatter and drift like leaves in autumn wind. And as we leave those toxic parlors behind, as the Victorian shadows recede into history, let your mind wander forward with me, because the walls weren't the only danger. The Victorians found remarkably creative ways to surround themselves with poison. Next, we'll explore what happened when they extended their love of color and chemistry to the very clothes they wore. Now then, let's talk about fashion. Close your eyes and imagine the most beautiful ball gown you've ever seen. We're talking about the Victorian era again, sometime around 1860. And this dress is absolutely magnificent. It's made of silk taffeta in the most stunning shade of emerald green. That green again, yes, because the Victorians simply couldn't get enough of it. The dress catches the light as the wearer moves, shimmering and rustling with every step. The ballroom is lit by hundreds of candles, and in that flickering golden light, the green seems almost supernatural, as if the dress itself is glowing from within. It is glowing, in a way, glowing with poison. Let your body relax even more deeply into your mattress as I tell you about the fashion industry of the 1800s. This was the era when fashion really became democratized, when mass production meant that middle-class women could afford to follow trends that had once been reserved for aristocrats. Magazines published the latest styles from Paris and London. Department stores displayed ready-made gowns alongside fabrics and trimmings for those who sewed at home. Everyone wanted to be fashionable, to show their taste and status through their clothing. And nothing was more fashionable than color-bright, brilliant, eye-catching color that would make you stand out in any ballroom or drawing room. The problem, as you might have guessed, was how they achieved those colors. Arsenic wasn't just in wallpaper. It was in dyes, particularly greens. Shields green, Paris green, emerald green, all variations on the same theme, all based on copper arsenite or copper acetorsenite compounds. These pigments could be applied to fabric, creating dresses, gloves, ribbons, stockings, and shoes in shades that simply weren't achievable with natural dyes. A woman wearing an arsenic-dyed dress was literally draped in poison from head to toe. Think about what it meant to wear one of these gowns. The fabric would rest against your skin all evening, potentially for 10 or 12 hours if you were attending a major social event. Victorian ladies didn't dress casually. A ball gown was an elaborate construction involving a corset, multiple petticoats, the dress itself with its yards and yards of fabric, and all manner of accessories. You'd be wrapped in this finery, and if the dress was dyed with arsenic, you'd be absorbing small amounts through your skin the entire time. Your pores would open with the exertion of dancing, the warmth of crowded rooms, and the poison would find its way into your bloodstream. But skin absorption was actually the least of your worries. The real danger came from the dust. Victorian dresses, especially evening gowns, shed all that fabric, rubbing against itself, against furniture, against other dancers. Clothing it would release tiny particles of dye into the air. A fashionably dressed woman would leave a trail of poisoned dust wherever she went. She'd breathe it in. Everyone around her would breathe it in. By the end of an evening, the air in a ballroom would be thick with fabric particles, perfume, smoke from the gaslights, and yes, arsenic. Imagine dancing the night away, growing flushed and breathless, your lungs pulling in deep breaths of poisoned air. Let me tell you about the seamstresses, because their story is particularly tragic. These were the women who made these beautiful gowns, who spent their days and nights bent over their sewing, handling the fabric for hours at a time. If you were a dressmaker working with arsenic-dyed fabrics, you'd be exposed to far higher concentrations than any woman who merely wore the dress. Your hands would be stained green. You'd breathe the dust all day long, and the symptoms would come on gradually: tremors, numbness in your extremities, weakness, nausea, skin lesions. Many seamstresses developed severe health problems, and more than a few died young. But who paid attention to the health of working-class women in Victorian England? Their deaths were just another sad statistic, another inevitable cost of industrial progress. There's a particularly haunting case I want to share with you, the kind of story that seems too tragic to be true, but absolutely is. In 1861, a 19-year-old woman named Matilda worked in a London factory that made artificial flowers, those elaborate fabric blooms that Victorian women used to decorate their hats and gowns. The factory used arsenic-based pigments to dye the fabrics green. Matilda's job involved handling these fabrics all day, breathing in the dust, getting the pigment on her hands and under her fingernails. She began to suffer from terrible symptoms: vomiting, convulsions, eyes that turned green, actually green from the poison building up in her system. She died an agonizing death, and her story made the newspapers, briefly stirring public concern before everyone moved on to the next scandal. But her death wasn't unique. It was just one of countless similar cases, most of which never made the papers, never stirred any concern at all. Working women were expendable in the Victorian economy. The fashion industry needed its colors, and if a few factory workers died to provide them, well, that was simply the price of progress and beauty. Now, let your mind drift to the upper-class women who wore these creations, blissfully unaware of the danger. They'd spend hours getting dressed, with maids helping them into their elaborate gowns. They'd admire themselves in the mirror, delighted by how the color brought out their eyes or complemented their complexion. They'd go to balls and soirees, receiving compliments on their stunning attire, never knowing they were slowly poisoning themselves and everyone around them. Some women did experience symptoms. Skin rashes were common, particularly where the fabric touched sensitive skin. Some women reported feeling faint or nauseous after wearing certain dresses. They'd blame the tight corsets or the heat of the ballroom, never suspecting their clothing. Others developed more serious symptoms: hair loss, neurological problems, chronic weakness. Victorian doctors, bless them, would diagnose hysteria or neurasthenia or any of a dozen other vague conditions that basically meant we have no idea what's wrong with you. It never occurred to most of them to ask about the patient's wardrobe. The truly maddening thing is that some people did know. There were doctors and chemists sounding the alarm as early as the 1850s. One particularly dedicated chemist, August Wilhelm von Hofmann, conducted experiments demonstrating just how much arsenic could be present in a single dress. He found that some gowns contained enough arsenic to kill dozens of people if it were all somehow extracted and administered at once. His research was published, reported in newspapers, and discussed in scientific circles. And fashion marched on, largely unchanged. Why? Well, partly because the alternative dyes were more expensive and less vibrant, but also because there was this deep cultural resistance to the idea that fashion could be dangerous. Fashion was supposed to be frivolous, superficial, a women's concern. The notion that women's clothing could be a serious health hazard seemed almost comical to many Victorians. Surely women were worrying over nothing. Surely the doctors raising alarms were being overdramatic. After all, not everyone who wore an arsenic dress dropped dead immediately. So how dangerous could it really be? This is where we see the Victorian love affair with denial. They wanted their beautiful colors, their stunning fashions, their visible displays of wealth and status. Admitting that these things were dangerous would require giving them up or spending more money on safer alternatives. So instead, they convinced themselves the danger was exaggerated or non-existent. The mind is remarkably good at rationalizing what it wants to believe. Let me paint you another picture, something to drift along with as your consciousness softens toward sleep. Picture a Victorian lady's bedroom at night. She's just returned from a ball, exhausted and exhilarated. Her maid helps her out of her beautiful green gown, carefully hanging it in the wardrobe. The dress will need to be brushed and aired out before it's worn again. Victorian garments required constant maintenance. As the maid works, tiny particles of green dust drift through the air, catching the candlelight like glitter. The lady breathes in deeply, tired but happy, ready for sleep. Neither woman realizes they're breathing poison. The dress hangs in the wardrobe, quietly contaminating the room, releasing its toxic dust into the air that will be breathed all night long. And it wasn't just green. Though green was the worst offender, other colors used other dangerous pigments. Red dyes often contained mercury. Yellow sometimes contains chromium or lead. White contained lead as well. Lead white was the standard pigment for achieving that brilliant, pure white that Victorian fashion prized, so you could theoretically poison yourself with almost any color. Though arsenic greens remained the most dangerous of the lot. Children's clothing was dyed with the same pigments, of course. Little girls wore miniature versions of adult fashions, complete with the same toxic dyes. Can you imagine dressing your child in poison and sending them off to play? But that's exactly what Victorian parents did, unknowingly, lovingly, wanting their children to look beautiful and fashionable. The smaller the body, the more vulnerable to toxins, so children suffered disproportionately. But who would connect a child's mysterious illness with their pretty green dress? The connections were too subtle, too delayed, too invisible. Fashion magazines of the era are fascinating to read now, with the benefit of hindsight. They discussed the latest colors and styles in breathless detail, occasionally mentioning in passing that some people claimed certain dyes were dangerous, but assuring readers that these concerns were overblown. A sensible woman need not worry, they'd write, essentially gaslighting their entire readership into accepting poisonous clothing as normal and safe. Trust the industry. Trust the manufacturers. Trust that someone somewhere is making sure these products are safe. Don't worry your pretty head about chemistry and toxicology. Some women did refuse to wear arsenic-dyed clothing once they learned about the dangers. There were small consumer movements, letters written to newspapers, pressure applied to manufacturers. But these were minority voices, easily dismissed or ignored. The majority of women continued to wear the fashions of the day because that's what was available, what was affordable, what was socially expected. If you wanted to participate in society, if you wanted to be taken seriously, you needed to dress appropriately. An appropriate dress included all those lovely poisonous colors. Here's a detail that might interest you as you drift closer to sleep. Dancers were particularly at risk. All that movement, all that physical exertion meant more sweat, more opened pores, more dust released from the fabric, and more dust inhaled. There were documented cases of dancers becoming seriously ill after wearing arsenic-dyed gowns to balls. Some collapsed on the dance floor. Others developed symptoms over the following days and weeks. The connection was right there, obvious to anyone willing to see it. But fashion was too powerful, the industry too profitable, the cultural investment too deep. It took until the 1870s for real change to begin. Synthetic dyes that didn't rely on arsenic or other toxic heavy metals became more available and affordable. Public pressure increased. A few high-profile cases, usually involving aristocratic women whose suffering couldn't be ignored quite as easily, finally broke through the wall of denial. Slowly, painfully, the fashion industry began to shift toward safer pigments. By the 1890s, arsenic dyes were largely phased out in favor of synthetic alternatives. Progress, finally, at the pace of a glacier. But think about all those decades of suffering, all those women who breathed in poison while trying to look beautiful, all those seamstresses who died young, their deaths unrecorded and unmourned, all those children dressed in toxic finery by parents who just wanted them to look nice. The Victorian era, that supposedly enlightened age of progress and industry, managed to turn fashion itself into a deadly hazard as the candles burned down in our imaginary Victorian ballroom, as the last dancers waltz through clouds of poisoned dust. Let yourself feel grateful for modern safety standards, for consumer protection laws, for the boring, unglamorous regulations that keep our clothing safe to wear. Your pajamas won't poison you. Your sheets won't make you sick. You can rest easy in every sense. And as we step out of that toxic ballroom, leaving behind the rustling silks and deadly satin. Let your mind follow me to another aspect of Victorian life where beauty and danger intertwined. Because if adults were willing to surround themselves with poison for the sake of fashion, what do you think they gave their children to play with? Let's drift forward now into the nursery, where the toys are bright and beautiful and just as deadly as everything else. Settle in a little deeper now, and let me tell you about the Victorian nursery. Picture a bright, cheerful room on the upper floor of a comfortable middle-class home. Sunlight streams through the windows, illuminating shelves full of toys. Tin soldiers lined up for battle. Beautiful dolls with porcelain faces and elaborate dresses. Wooden blocks painted in primary colors. Stuffed animals, lead figurines, toy tea sets in miniature perfection. It's every child's dream, a room dedicated entirely to play and imagination, and nearly everything in it is poisonous. Let your breathing slow as we explore this topic, because it's one of those stories that's so tragic it almost loops back around, too darkly funny. The Victorians loved their children, let's be clear about that. They weren't trying to harm them, but in their rush to give children the benefits of modern industry and mass production, they ended up filling nurseries with an astonishing array of toxic hazards. If you were a Victorian child, you were basically growing up in a super fun site that looked like a toy store. Let's start with paint, because paint is where a lot of the problems began. Those brightly colored toys were painted with pigments that often contained lead, arsenic, mercury, cadmium, and a whole cocktail of other heavy metals. Lead-based paint was particularly common because it was cheap, durable, and produced brilliant, lasting colors. Red paint, lead oxide; white paint, lead carbonate; yellow lead chromate. Green, well, we've already discussed what went into green paint, or old friend arsenic. Blues and purples might contain cobalt or other toxic compounds. Essentially, every color in the rainbow came with its own special poison. Now, imagine being a Victorian toddler. What do toddlers do? They put things in their mouths. It's how they explore the world, how they learn about textures and tastes. A Victorian child playing with painted wooden blocks would naturally chew on them, suck on them, get paint chips in their mouth. Every teething infant with a painted toy was essentially being given poison as a pacifier. The paint would flake off with use, and children would ingest it. They'd get paint dust on their hands and then put their hands in their mouths. And nobody understood why so many children suffered from mysterious ailments, developmental problems, or just wasted away for no apparent reason. Lead poisoning in children is particularly insidious. It affects neurological development, causing learning disabilities, behavioral problems, seizures, and in severe cases, death. But the symptoms could be vague and were often attributed to other causes. A child who was unusually fussy or slow to develop might be dismissed as difficult or simple. A child with stomach pains and vomiting might be thought to have a weak constitution. The connection to their toys wouldn't be made because lead poisoning doesn't announce itself. It just quietly damages developing brains and bodies, while everyone assumes children are just naturally prone to illness. Let me tell you about one particular type of toy that was wildly popular: painted tin toys. The Victorian era saw the rise of mass-produced tin toys. Everything from mechanical banks to tin soldiers to elaborate wind-up toys that could march or dance. These were marvels of their age, relatively affordable versions of toys that had once been expensive and handmade, and they were coated in lead-based paint, often in multiple bright colors. A child playing with a set of tin soldiers would be handling lead all day long. If the paint was chipping or flaking, and paint on heavily used toys is always chips and flakes, the child would be ingesting lead on a regular basis. Tin toys were also sometimes made with soldered seams, and the solder contained lead as well. So even if the paint somehow wasn't a problem, the construction itself was toxic. Victorian parents would watch their children play with these toys, pleased that they could provide such nice things for their offspring, never knowing they were facilitating slow poisoning. Now, let's talk about dolls, because Victorian dolls are a special kind of terrible. Porcelain dolls had faces painted with those same toxic pigments, rosy cheeks from mercury compounds, glossy red lips from cinnabar, which is mercury sulfide, white skin from lead-based paint. The dolls' elaborate dresses were often dyed with arsenic, just like adult clothing. Some dolls had hair made from real human hair, which was fine if macabre, but others used fibers dyed with toxic compounds. And if a child loved their doll enough to kiss it, to sleep with it, to carry it everywhere, they'd be exposed to all these poisons on a daily basis. There were also composition dolls, made from various materials, including glue, sawdust, and other compounds, sometimes containing arsenic as a preservative to keep the materials from rotting or being eaten by insects. So the very body of the doll could be toxic, not just the paint on its surface. Victorian children were cuddling poison while they slept. Let your mind drift now to the Victorian obsession with educational toys. This was the era when people really started to think seriously about child development and education. Parents wanted toys that would teach their children, that would prepare them for adult life. So the market is filled with alphabet blocks, counting toys, geography puzzles, miniature scientific instruments, and toy versions of adult tools and occupations. All wonderful in theory, all frequently toxic in practice. Alphabet blocks are a perfect example. These were wooden blocks with letters painted on them, designed to teach children the alphabet. Clever, right? Except the paint was often lead-based, and children would mouth the blocks while learning. So yes, little Timmy is learning his ABCs, but he's also getting a daily dose of neurotoxins. The irony is, almost poetic toys designed to help cognitive development actively hamper it through poison exposure. There were also chemistry sets and scientific toys marketed to older children, which seems particularly wild in retrospect. Victorian boys, and it was usually boys. Girls were generally steered toward dolls, and domestic play could get chemistry sets that contained actual dangerous chemicals. We're talking about substances that would never be allowed in a modern child's toy: phosphorus, acids, heavy metal compounds, all sorts of things that could burn, poison, or explode if mishandled. The Victorian faith in education and scientific progress was so strong that they'd hand children literal poison and call it learning. Picture this: a 10-year-old boy in his room, excited about his new chemistry set, mixing compounds with no adult supervision and minimal understanding of what he's doing. The instructions are written in that optimistic Victorian style that assumes children are basically tiny adults capable of perfect safety precautions. nobody's wearing goggles or gloves. Ventilation means maybe opening a window. And if something goes wrong, if the child burns themselves, or breathes in toxic fumes, or accidentally creates a more violent reaction than intended, well, boys will be boys. That's just the rough and tumble of childhood. Let me tell you about toy soldiers, because they're another category of Victorian toy that was essentially a lead delivery system. Toy soldiers were hugely popular, especially as the British Empire was at its height and military glory was a constant cultural presence. Sets of hundreds of soldiers could be purchased, representing different regiments, historical armies, or imaginary forces. Children would spend hours arranging them, fighting battles, creating elaborate scenarios. And these toy soldiers were made of lead, not painted with lead made of lead. Solid lead castings, sometimes with paint added on top for extra color, but fundamentally just shaped pieces of the toxic metal. Children would handle these for hours. Lead would rub off on their hands. They'd put their hands in their mouths. Some children would even chew on the soldiers directly, either out of habit or because they were teething. And lead has a slightly sweet taste, which makes it particularly dangerous. It doesn't trigger the bitter taste warning that might make a child spit out other harmful substances. So Victorian children were essentially sucking on lead lollipops shaped like soldiers, all while their parents looked on fondly, pleased that their child was developing an appreciation for military history. The really maddening part is that some people did raise concerns. There were doctors and reformers who tried to sound the alarm about toxic toys. In the late 1800s, there were occasional articles in medical journals and reform-minded publications warning about the dangers of lead, paint, and other toxic materials in children's toys. But the toy industry was profitable and largely unregulated. Manufacturers would publish their own reassurances, claiming their products were perfectly safe. And most parents wanted to believe that the toys available in respectable shops were fine. Surely someone was making sure these things were safe. Surely modern industrial society has progressed beyond selling dangerous products to children. Nobody was making sure. There were no safety standards, no regulatory agencies, no testing requirements. If a manufacturer wanted to use the cheapest materials and most toxic paints to maximize profit, they could do so freely. And many did, because that's what the market incentivized. The invisible hand of the free market was patting children on the head with a glove full of arsenic and lead. Now, let your thoughts drift to a related topic: candy and sweets. Victorian children, like children of all eras, loved candy, and the Victorian candy industry managed to make even sweets dangerous through a combination of toxic coloring agents and deliberate adulteration. We've already mentioned arsenic-based green coloring in sweets, but that was just the beginning. Red candies might contain mercury or lead-based pigments. Yellow candies could contain chromium compounds. White candies were sometimes brightened with chalk or plaster, which could contain lead. And some unscrupulous candy makers would add weight products by mixing in substances like lead, chromate, or copper sulfate. There were documented cases of children dying or becoming seriously ill from eating contaminated candy. One particularly notorious case involved cheap candy colored with a substance called Schweinfurt-Grüne form of arsenic compound that was used because it was cheaper than other green pigments. Children bought these bright green sweets from street vendors or cheap shops, ate them eagerly, and suffered the consequences. Some vomited and recovered, some died. And still the candy was produced and sold because there were no regulations preventing it. Let yourself imagine a Victorian street scene now, seen from a child's perspective. A penny in your pocket, the smell of sweets from a vendor's cart, bright colors that promise a moment of sugar-fueled happiness. You buy a piece of green candy, pop it in your mouth, savor the sweetness. You don't know you're also tasting arsenic. You don't know that the beautiful color comes from poison. You're just a child who wanted a treat. The same problems affected other food products marketed to children. Milk was sometimes adulterated with chalk or plaster to make it look whiter and thicker, disguising how watered down it was. That chalk might contain lead. Baked goods were whitened with alum, which could cause digestive problems. Even something as simple as bread could be dangerous if the baker was dishonest or ignorant about the additives they were using. The Victorian food industry was a minefield of potential hazards, and children, with their smaller bodies and developing systems, were the most vulnerable. There's a certain dark irony to all of this. The Victorian era was when people really started to develop modern ideas about childhood as a special, protected phase of life. The Romantics had elevated childhood to this almost sacred status, seeing children as innocent beings who needed nurturing and protection. Laws were passed limiting child labor, requiring education, recognizing that children weren't just small adults, but had special needs and vulnerabilities. And yet, the same society that was developing these enlightened ideas about childhood was selling children toys and sweets laced with poison. It wasn't until the early 20th century that real reforms began. The Pure Food and Drug Act in the United States in 1906. Similar laws in Britain and Europe around the same time finally started to regulate what could be put in food and, eventually, what materials could be used in children's products. Consumer advocacy groups formed, pushed for change, demanded that manufacturers be held accountable. Slowly, painfully slowly, the most toxic practices were outlawed or abandoned. Lead paint wasn't fully banned in the US until 1978, which means there were children playing with lead-painted toys well into the modern era. The Victorian legacy lasted a long time as you sink deeper into your comfortable, safe bed. In your modern home, with its regulated products and safety standards, let yourself feel grateful for all those boring bureaucrats and activists who fought for toy safety standards, for food purity laws, for regulations that make childhood less of a toxic hazard. Your children, if you have them, or the children in your life, can play without being slowly poisoned. They can eat candy without ingesting arsenic. They can learn their ABCs without lead exposure. It's a small miracle of modern life that we mostly take for granted. And as we leave the Victorian nursery behind, as the toy soldiers march back into history and the dolls rest on their shelves, let your mind follow me to yet another way the Victorians accidentally poisoned themselves. Because we've talked about homes, about fashion, about childhood, but we haven't yet discussed the rituals of daily life, the cosmetics, the medicines, the household products that people use every single day. Let's drift into that space now, into the intimate daily routines that were laced with danger. Take a deep breath and let it out slowly as we enter the Victorian ladies' dressing room. The morning light filters through lace curtains, illuminating a vanity table covered with bottles, jars, and pots. There are lotions and powders, rouges and lipsticks, hair dyes and skin treatments, all the tools needed to create the Victorian ideal of beauty. It's an intimate space where a woman would spend time each day transforming herself into the image society demanded. And nearly every product on that table contains something that could harm or kill her. Let me tell you about the Victorian beauty standard, because understanding it helps explain why women were willing to use such dangerous products. The ideal Victorian woman had skin like porcelain, absolutely white, smooth, and unblemished. Pale skin indicated that you didn't work outdoors, that you were refined and delicate, that you were a lady rather than a working woman. Any hint of tan or ruddiness suggested a lower-class background, so women went to extraordinary lengths to achieve and maintain that pallid perfection. The most popular way to whiten skin was with products containing lead or mercury. Lead-based face powders and creams had been used for centuries. They were literally called cerus, and they'd been a staple of upper-class beauty routines since at least the Renaissance. By the Victorian era, you could buy lead-based cosmetics in any pharmacy or department store. They worked beautifully, creating that smooth, white appearance that fashion demanded. They also caused skin damage, hair loss, tremors, neurological problems, and eventually death if used long enough. But oh, the results were immediate and dramatic. Mercury-based skin products were marketed as beautifiers or complexion enhancers. They were supposed to remove freckles, age spots, and any other imperfections. Mercury does indeed affect skin pigmentation by destroying melanin-producing cells and essentially burning the top layers of skin. Women would apply these products diligently, watching their freckles fade, never realizing they were chemically burning themselves. The results seemed like magic. The reality was tissue damage and systemic poisoning. Let your mind picture a Victorian woman sitting at her vanity, carefully applying her morning face cream. It's thick and slightly gritty, with a peculiar metallic smell she's grown accustomed to. She smooths it over her face and neck, working it into her skin. She does this every morning, has done so for years. She's pleased with how her complexion has lightened, how smooth her skin appears. She doesn't notice the slight tremor in her hands or the way she's been feeling increasingly tired and irritable. She doesn't connect these symptoms to her beauty routine. She just knows she looks fashionable, and that's what matters. Hair dye is another fascinating horror story. Victorian women, like women of all eras, sometimes wanted to change their hair color, and Victorian hair dyes were spectacularly toxic. Many contained lead compounds. Lead acetate was a common ingredient in dyes designed to darken gray hair. Others contained silver nitrate, which could turn hair a peculiar purple-gray color with sun exposure and could be absorbed through the scalp. Some hair dyes contained arsenic or mercury compounds. Basically, Victorian women were painting their heads with poison, then leaving it on for hours while it soaked into their scalps. There are documented cases of women suffering severe poisoning from hair dye. Symptoms included headaches, dizziness, nausea, and in severe cases, paralysis or death. But hair dye poisoning could also be chronic and subtle, causing cumulative damage over years of use. A woman might just feel progressively worse, developing vague symptoms that could be attributed to any number of causes. Her hair looks beautiful though, right? Up until it starts falling out, which lead and mercury exposure can definitely cause. Then she might switch to a different product, never realizing the problem was the entire category of Victorian hair dyes, not just one brand. Now, let's talk about rouge and lipstick, because surely makeup for the face must be safer, right? Wrong. Victorian rouge, the powder or cream used to add color to cheeks and lips, frequently contained mercury-based vermilion or cinnabar. These products created a beautiful, lasting red color. They also poisoned the user through skin absorption and accidental ingestion. Every time a woman ate or drank while wearing toxic lipstick, she was consuming a small amount of mercury. Over time, over years of daily use, that added up to significant exposure. Some rouge products contained lead or arsenic-based red pigments instead. So really, you had your choice of poisons when selecting how to color your face. The symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning included tremors, personality changes, insomnia, and a host of other neurological symptoms. In severe cases, it could cause a condition called erethism or Mad Hatter disease. Yes, like the Mad Hatter from Alice in Wonderland, whose madness was based on the real occupational hazard of hat makers who used mercury in their work. Victorian women applying toxic makeup could literally drive themselves insane. Slowly and fashionably, let your breathing slow even more as I tell you about arsenic wafers and complexion pills. These were products that women ingested deliberately to improve their skin. Arsenic, in small doses, can temporarily improve skin appearance by causing slight inflammation and swelling that makes the skin look plumper and more youthful. Victorian pharmaceutical companies marketed arsenic wafers and pills as beauty treatments. Women would take them daily, following the recommended doses, watching their complexions improve, not understanding that they were systematically poisoning themselves. Some of these products were marketed as health tonics or blood purifiers rather than explicitly as cosmetics. But the appeal was the same: improved appearance and enhanced beauty. The doses were supposedly safe, though safe is a relative term when you're talking about a cumulative poison. Women who used these products regularly over years could develop arsenic-chronic arsenic poisoning with symptoms including skin lesions, peripheral neuropathy, and increased cancer risk. But in the short term, their skin looked great, and that's what the advertisements promised. Eye products were their own special nightmare. Belladonna nightshade was used to dilate pupils because large pupils were considered attractive and gave the eyes a soft, dreamy appearance. Women would put drops containing atropine, the active component of belladonna, directly into their eyes. This worked wonderfully for cosmetic purposes. It also caused blurred vision, sensitivity to light, and with repeated use or high doses, could cause more serious symptoms, including confusion, hallucinations, and cardiovascular problems. But the eyes looked so beautiful, large and dark and mysterious. Picture an evening in a Victorian ballroom now. The women are all dressed in their finest, their faces pale with lead powder, their cheeks red with mercury rouge, their lips stained with toxic pigments. Their eyes are wide and dark, from belladonna drops. They look ethereal, almost supernatural, like porcelain dolls come to life. And they're all slowly poisoning themselves. Every woman in that room is wearing poison on her face and has poison in her bloodstream. The price of beauty, accepted without question, because that's just what women did. That's what society expected. Men weren't entirely exempt from cosmetic dangers, though they used fewer products overall. But hair dye marketed to men had the same problems as women's hair dye. Shaving products sometimes contained toxic ingredients, and men, like women, used medicinal products that were often just as dangerous as cosmetics. Which brings us to Victorian medicine. The Victorian medicine chest is a treasure trove of toxins. This was an era when many medicines were based on heavy metals and other dangerous substances, because those were the most powerful drugs available. Mercury, arsenic, lead, opium, cocaine, and alcohol were all common ingredients in patent medicines and prescriptions. Some of these substances do have legitimate medical uses in controlled doses, but Victorian dosing was often wildly inappropriate, and many products contained dangerous ingredients without clear labeling. Let me tell you about calomel, which was essentially mercury chloride. It was used as a laxative and as a treatment for a wide variety of conditions. Victorian doctors prescribed it liberally. It was incredibly effective as a laxative. Mercury compounds will definitely clear out your digestive system, but it was also toxic. Regular use could lead to mercury poisoning. Excessive doses could cause severe damage to the mouth and digestive tract, even death. But it was considered a standard, respectable medicine, something every household would keep on hand. Arsenic was also used medicinally, prescribed for everything from skin conditions to syphilis. Small doses of arsenic were thought to be tonic, improving vitality and health. Whether they actually helped with specific conditions is debatable, but they definitely caused cumulative poisoning if used long-term. Victorian doctors, working with the best knowledge available at the time, were prescribing poison to treat illness, sometimes making their patients sicker in the process. Patent medicines were even worse because they were unregulated and often contained undisclosed ingredients. A bottle labeled as a nerve tonic might contain opium, cocaine, alcohol, and various heavy metals. A soothing syrup for teething babies. Yes, they gave these to infants could contain morphine or other opiates. People bought these products, trusting that they were safe and effective, and the manufacturers had no legal obligation to tell consumers what was actually in the bottle, or to prove that it worked or wouldn't cause harm. Think about what it meant to be sick in the Victorian era. You'd go to the doctor or the pharmacy seeking help, and you'd be given medicine that might actually make you worse. You'd take it faithfully, following directions, trusting in modern medicine. And sometimes you'd recover maybe from the medicine, maybe despite the medicine, maybe just because time and your own immune system did the work. But sometimes the medicine itself would poison you, and nobody would necessarily make the connection because the symptoms of heavy metal poisoning can mimic so many illnesses. As you relax even deeper into your bed, consider the children's medicines. Victorian parents loved their children and wanted to ease their suffering when they were sick or fussy. So they'd give them patent medicines specifically marketed for children. These products had names like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup or Dr. Mather's baby syrup. and they were advertised as gentle and safe for even the youngest infants. And they contained morphine, opium, heroin, or other narcotics. Victorian babies were being dosed with opiates to make them quiet and sleepy, and the parents thought they were being responsible caregivers by using these products. Teething was considered a particularly dangerous time for babies. Victorian infant mortality was high, and teething often coincided with the age when babies became vulnerable to various infections and illnesses. So parents would give their teething babies opioid-based syrups to ease the pain and help them sleep. Some babies were dosed so heavily or so frequently that they became addicted or suffered fatal overdoses. But the products remained on the market because there were no regulations preventing it, and the manufacturers made substantial profits. Let your thoughts drift to the Victorian bathroom cabinet, imagining all those bottles and tins. Cough syrup containing heroin. Yes, really. Bayer marketed heroin as a cough suppressant under that brand name. Asthma treatments containing strychnine, tonics and elixirs with alcohol content that would make them illegal to sell without a liquor license today. Skin treatments with mercury, digestive aids with arsenic, pain relievers with cocaine. It's like a museum of terrible ideas. Except people were actively using all of these products, often multiple products at once, creating unpredictable chemical interactions in their bodies. The tragedy is that people trusted these products. They trusted doctors, pharmacists, and manufacturers. They believed that modern industrial society, with all its progress and scientific advancement, had created safe and effective medicines. They believed that the products available in respectable shops must be acceptable to use, and that trust was betrayed again and again by an industry that prioritized profit over safety, and by a lack of regulation that allowed dangerous products to flood the market. It wasn't until the early 20th century that serious reform began. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 in the United States, and similar laws in other countries, finally started to require that medicines be labeled with their ingredients, and that claims of effectiveness be somewhat substantiated. But even these early regulations were weak by modern standards. It took decades more, and several high-profile tragedies, before truly strict pharmaceutical regulations were put in place. The modern FDA-style system of drug approval, testing, and monitoring is a relatively recent development, born from hard lessons about what happens when you let industry regulate itself, as the Victorian lady finishes her beauty routine and turns away from her vanity. As the medicine cabinet closes and the patent medicine bottles are tucked away, let yourself feel grateful once again for modern safety standards. The products you use on your skin, the medicines you take, have been tested and regulated. They have ingredient lists you can read. There are agencies whose job is to make sure these products won't poison you. It's not a perfect system, nothing human ever is, but it's so much better than what came before. And as we leave the dressing room and medicine cabinet behind, as the Victorian obsession with beauty and health fades into history, let your mind follow me to one more aspect of daily life where danger lurks. We've talked about homes, fashion, childhood, beauty, and medicine. Now let's talk about food and drink, about what Victorians ate and how even something as basic as a meal could be unexpectedly hazardous. Let yourself sink into complete relaxation now as we think about the bigger picture. about what all these stories of Victorian poison tell us about the past and maybe about ourselves. Take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and drift with me through one final reflection on the dangers of Victorian life and what they mean. The Victorian era, roughly spanning from 1837 to 1901, was a time of unprecedented change. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, transforming every aspect of life. Cities were growing at astonishing rates. New technologies emerged constantly: railways, telegraphs, photography, mass-produced goods of every description. Science was unlocking the secrets of the natural world at an accelerating pace. Medicine was advancing, though perhaps not as quickly as people thought. The British Empire was at its height, and there was a prevailing sense that civilization was reaching new peaks of achievement. All this confidence, people were surrounded by invisible dangers that their modern science and industry had created without quite understanding. That's the paradox at the heart of the Victorian experience. They were so confident in their advancement, so sure that they were leaving behind the primitive dangers of earlier eras, that they didn't recognize the new dangers they were creating. They thought they were safe because they were modern, but modernity itself was poisoning them. Let your mind explore why this happened, because it's not as simple as saying the Victorians were ignorant or careless. In many ways, they were doing the best they could with the knowledge available. The problem was that their technology advanced faster than their understanding of its consequences. They could create brilliant synthetic dyes before they understood toxicology. They could mass-produce consumer goods before they had systems for regulating their safety. They could industrialize food production before they understood microbiology and the importance of sanitation. The gap between capability and comprehension created a space where dangerous things flourished. Think about arsenic-green, our recurring theme throughout this night. Shield discovered how to make this brilliant, stable green in 1775. It was revolutionary, finally, a green that didn't fade, that stayed vibrant for years. The Victorians embraced it enthusiastically because it solved a real problem and created beautiful results. But the science of toxicology was still developing. The connection between arsenic exposure and illness wasn't immediately obvious, because arsenic poisoning is cumulative and its symptoms are varied and nonspecific. By the time people started making the connections, by the time chemists and doctors began publishing warnings, the arsenic-green industry was established, profitable and resistant to change. This pattern repeated across all the dangers we've discussed tonight: lead-based paint and cosmetics. The dangers of lead had been known in some form since Roman times. There are ancient texts warning about lead poisoning in miners and people who worked with lead. But somehow that knowledge didn't translate into consumer awareness or protective regulations. The lead was cheap and effective, and the harm it caused was slow and easily attributed to other causes. So people continued to use lead-based products even after warnings were published, even after individual cases of poisoning were documented. Let your breathing slow even more as we consider the role of industry and commerce in perpetuating these dangers. The Victorian era was the height of laissez-faire capitalism, with minimal regulation of business and strong cultural beliefs in free markets and individual responsibility. If a product was dangerous, the thinking went, consumers would stop buying it. If workers were being harmed, they'd seek employment elsewhere. The market would sort everything out without need for government interference. This philosophy sounds logical in theory, but breaks down in the face of asymmetric information and power imbalances. Consumers couldn't know that wallpaper contained arsenic because it wasn't labeled. Workers often had no alternatives. If every factory used toxic materials and you needed to feed your family, you took the available work. And manufacturers had strong incentives to hide or downplay dangers because admitting problems would hurt profits and might lead to regulation. So the market didn't correct itself. It required external pressure from reformers, journalists, doctors, scientists to force change. The resistance to reform is one of the most frustrating aspects of these stories. Again and again, we see the pattern. Danger is identified, evidence is published, warnings are issued, and nothing much happens. The wallpaper industry ignored warnings about arsenic for decades. The cosmetics industry continued to sell lead and mercury products long after their dangers were known. The food industry fought tooth and nail against any regulation of adulteration because acknowledging the dangers would require change, would reduce profits, would admit that the industries had been harming people. It was easier to deny, to publish counter-studies, to assure the public that concerns were exaggerated. This should sound familiar, because we see similar patterns today. Industries resisting evidence that their products cause harm. Public confusion created by deliberately misleading information. Decades-long delays between identifying a danger and implementing effective regulation. The specific threats have changed. We're not worried about arsenic, wallpaper anymore. But the underlying dynamics remain recognizable. Lead paint wasn't banned in the United States until 1978, long after its dangers were thoroughly documented. Asbestos was used for decades after it was known to cause cancer. We're currently watching similar debates play out around various industrial chemicals, plastics, and environmental pollutants. Let your thoughts drift to what made change possible when it finally came. In every case we've discussed, reform required multiple factors to align. It required scientific evidence, yes, but evidence alone wasn't enough. It required people willing to publicize that evidence and advocate for change. Journalists, doctors, chemists, activists. It required political will to pass and enforce new regulations. It required public pressure, consumers demanding safer products and supporting reform efforts. And it required time, often frustrating amounts of time, for these factors to overcome industry resistance and cultural inertia. The Victorian reformers, who fought for food safety laws, for regulations on dangerous substances, for workers' protections, they're mostly forgotten now. We benefit from their efforts every day, every time we trust that the food we buy is actually what it claims to be. Every time we use products that have been tested for safety, but we don't think about the people who made those protections possible. They fought battles that must have seemed frustrating and endless, facing well-funded opposition and public apathy, achieving incremental progress over years and decades. But their work mattered. It saved lives, prevented suffering, and created the foundation for modern consumer protection. As you drift even closer to sleep, consider what these Victorian stories tell us about human nature and social progress. We like to think we learn from history, that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. But the truth is more complicated. We do learn, yes, modern safety standards are dramatically better than Victorian standards, and that represents real learning and progress. But we also keep making variations of the same mistakes, because the underlying incentives and human tendencies don't change that much. We're still capable of letting short-term gains override long-term safety. We're still vulnerable to reassuring lies from industries with something to hide. We're still prone to assuming that whatever is modern and widely used must be safe. The Victorian era teaches us that progress is real but complicated. The Victorians genuinely improved life. In many ways, they increased literacy, reduced child labor, expanded political participation, advanced medical knowledge, and made consumer goods available to a broader population. Those are real achievements. But they also created new problems, some of which they didn't recognize until much later. Progress in one area doesn't guarantee progress in all areas. Advancing technology doesn't automatically come with the wisdom to use it safely. Every generation has to figure out the consequences of its innovations, often learning through painful experience. Think about the Victorian faith in industry and progress. How similar it is to our own modern faith in technology and innovation. We assume that new products have been tested. We trust that someone somewhere is making sure that what's available to buy won't harm us. And mostly that trust is justified. Our regulatory systems, imperfect as they are, do provide real protection. But not always. Not completely. There are still things we're exposed to regularly that future generations will look back on with horror, wondering how we didn't know, didn't see, didn't protect ourselves better. Think about the Victorian faith in industry and progress. How similar it is to our own modern faith in technology and innovation. We assume that new products have been tested and are safe. We trust that someone, somewhere, is making sure that what's available to buy won't harm us. And mostly, that trust is justified. Our regulatory systems, imperfect as they are, do provide real protection. But not always. Not completely. There are still things we're exposed to regularly that future generations will look back on with horror, wondering how we didn't know, didn't see, didn't protect ourselves better. What might those things be? It's hard to say, because if we clearly understood the dangers, we'd presumably be doing something about them. That's the nature of these invisible threats. They're invisible partly because we're not looking in the right places, or because the effects are too subtle or delayed to easily connect to causes, or because there are powerful interests invested in maintaining our ignorance. The Victorians who decorated their homes with arsenic wallpaper thought they were being fashionable and modern. We probably have our own equivalence things we do routinely, assuming they're fine, that will someday be recognized as harmful. This isn't meant to make you anxious, especially not as you're drifting toward sleep. Rather, it's meant to cultivate a kind of gentle, informed skepticism. Question assumptions. Support the boring but crucial work of safety, regulation, and enforcement. Listen to scientists and doctors, even when industries are telling you not to worry. Recognize that everyone does it, and it's always been this way, are not guarantees of safety. And appreciate the protections you do have. The regulations and standards that mostly work, the institutions that mostly keep you safe, because they didn't create themselves. They're the result of generations of effort by people who fought to make the world a little less dangerous. Let yourself feel the weight of history now. The long chain of human experience that connects you to those Victorian families in their arsenic-papered rooms, wearing their poisonous dresses, giving their children toxic toys. They weren't so different from us. They loved their families, wanted to be healthy and attractive, trusted the products available in respectable shops, and believed in the essential goodness of progress. They made the best choices they could with the information available to them, and they suffered consequences they didn't anticipate and often didn't understand. We're doing the same thing, really. Making choices based on current understanding, trusting systems that are imperfect, living with risks we don't fully comprehend. Future generations will look back at us the way we look back at the Victorians, with a mixture of sympathy and bewilderment, wondering how we didn't know things that seem obvious in retrospect. That's just the nature of being human, of living forward in time with incomplete information and making the best decisions we can. The Victorian paradox, progress and danger intertwined, confidence and vulnerability existing side by side. Faith in modernity, creating new reasons for caution, is really just the human paradox. We're capable of remarkable ingenuity and equally remarkable blindness. We solve problems and create new ones. We learn and forget and learn again. We're both smarter and more foolish than we think we are, and that's okay. That's just how it is. As the last gaslight flickers out in our Victorian rooms, as the arsenic wallpaper fades into history, as the dangerous beauty of that era recedes into the past, let yourself feel grateful for what you have. For boring safety standards and unglamorous regulations, for ingredient labels and product testing, for the knowledge we've gained through generations of painful experience, for the reformers and activists and scientists and bureaucrats who made the modern world a little bit safer, even if we don't remember their names. And let yourself feel compassionate toward those Victorians, those people trying to navigate a rapidly changing world, making choices that seemed reasonable at the time, loving their families. They were us, just in different circumstances. Their mistakes are human mistakes, the kind any of us might make when faced with new technologies and incomplete information, and the powerful human desire to believe that everything will be fine. The Victorian era ended more than a century ago. Those arsenic-papered rooms are gone, or have been stripped and renovated long since. Those poisonous dresses have disintegrated in museum storage or turned to dust in forgotten trunks. Those toxic toys have mostly been thrown away, though a few survive in collections, handled carefully by people in gloves who understand what they are. The people who lived in those dangerous conditions are gone, every single one of them. Their struggles and suffering and small daily dangers faded into history, but the lessons remain if we choose to learn them. Progress is wonderful, but requires wisdom. Modernity isn't automatically safety. Beautiful things can be dangerous. Trust should be thoughtful rather than blind. Change is possible, but requires effort. And every generation has to figure out how to live safely in its own particular moment, with its own particular challenges. Learning from the past while facing forward into an uncertain future. So rest easy now, in your safe, modern bed, in your regulated, mostly safe, modern world. Let the stories of Victorian dangers drift away like smoke from an extinguished candle. Let yourself relax completely, your body sinking into the mattress, your breathing slow and deep, your mind quiet and peaceful. You've traveled back in time tonight, visited rooms and lives from a century and a half ago, learned about the hidden dangers of an age that thought it was the pinnacle of civilization. And now it's time to return fully to the present, to this moment, to this room, to your own safe space. The past has its lessons, but the present has its comforts. Your walls aren't trying to kill you. Your clothes aren't poisoning you. Your toys, if you have them nearby, are safe. Your cosmetics have been tested. Your medicines are regulated. Your food is what it claims to be. You can rest without worry, at least about these particular threats. May these memories of Victorian dangers guide you into peaceful dreams. May you sleep soundly, knowing you're safer than those people were. That progress, for all its complications, has made the world more livable in many ways. May you wake refreshed, grateful for boring modern safety, and perhaps a little more curious about the hidden history in the objects and practices we take for granted. If this journey helped you unwind, if my voice became a familiar companion guiding you toward rest, go ahead and let me know in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from, what time it is in your corner of the world, whether you managed to stay awake through all 6 chapters or drifted off somewhere in the middle. I love hearing from you, love knowing these stories and this gentle approach to history help you find rest. And if you'd like more journeys like this, more slow drifts through history's quieter corners, go ahead and subscribe. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more forgotten details of daily life to explore together. This is Boring History for Sleep, where the past is fascinating but never urgent, interesting but always gentle, rich with detail but designed to ease you into rest rather than keeping you awake. Sweet dreams, my friends. Sleep well. Let the Victorians rest in peace, their dangerous, beautiful world preserved in memory but no longer able to harm anyone. And let yourself rest too, in safety and comfort, wrapped in the unglamorous miracle of modern life. Good night.